medical tourism. And again, South Florida per se has a lot to offer to this particular theme. And for this, I'd like to first of all, again, I would not introduce the panelists themselves. I'd like to introduce the moderator, who is Charlie Whelan. He has more than 10 years of market research with Frost & Sullivan as basically within different strategy, analysis, consulting, and really having worked with more than 75 different projects worldwide. Charlie has a very particular expertise on market and development for modeling, trend, forecasting, in the communications, competitive intelligence, and many different things. So has also the experience of have covered a broad range of healthcare sectors, including, of course, medical, surgical, and of course, patient monitoring technologies. So I would like to please welcome me and give me a warm welcome to our panelist, Charlie Whelan from Frost & Sullivan. And he's going to bring the panelists with him. So thank you very much. Stage is all yours, Charlie. Take it away.
Is the mic on? Thank you. Well, thank you for the introduction. It's my pleasure to bring some esteemed panelists to you to talk about the topic of medical tourism. Obviously, we talked about Southern Florida as being at the crossroads of the Americas. And one of the things that we're seeing is medical tourism is becoming a significantly growing field all around the world, as we're seeing a convergence of many different factors in terms of access to care, in terms of economics, globalization, technology, really transforming it and really having a significant impact. And I think all of us agree that Southern Florida is in a very prime position to take advantage of that. So on our right here, we have Dr. Alejandro Badia, our local representative. Dr. Badia is a hand and upper extremity surgeon at Badia Hand to Shoulder Center. Dr. Badia studied physiology at Cornell and obtained his medical degree at NYU, where he also trained in orthopedics. A hand fellowship at Allegheny General Hospital in Pittsburgh was followed by an AO trauma fellowship in Freiburg, Germany. He runs an active international hand fellowship, serves on the editorial board of 2 hand journals, and organizes a yearly Miami meeting for surgeons and therapists that is devoted to upper limb arthroscopy and arthroplasty. This international meeting is held at the world-renowned Miami Anatomical Research Center, the world's largest surgical cadaveric training lab, in which Dr. Badia co-founded in 2005. In 2008, he completed the Badia Hand to Shoulder Center, a fully integrated clinical facility for the upper limb, also encompassing the surgery center at Doral, Integra Rehabilitation, and an MRI imaging facility. More recently, Dr. Badia inaugurated OrthoNow, the first immediate orthopedic care center in South Florida, which is staffed by surgeons from the International Orthopedic Group, a group of surgeons from lower extremity, upper limb, and spine subspecialties who also treat elective orthopedic problems in international patients. So he is very actively enmeshed right now in delivering medical care to international patients in the medical tourism field. We also have Dr. David Vequist, who's the founder and director of the Center for Medical Tourism Research, which is the first academic research center devoted to medical tourism research. He's also a tenured full professor of management in the HEB School of Business and Administration at the University of Incarnate Word in San Antonio, Texas, where the center is based. He's an accomplished speaker, author, researcher, and futurist on the topic of medical and retirement tourism, and has presented on 5 continents about the business of medical travel. He's also produced numerous articles, papers, and book chapters on the subject, and is currently writing a book on the economic impact of medical tourism. His center has held several medical tourism research conferences around the world and has also consulted with companies, NGOs, and countries such as Colombia, Egypt, Korea, Mexico, Malaysia, Guatemala, Turkey, and the United Nations. So please give my panelists a warm welcome. So one of the first questions I'd like to pose to both panelists is my understanding is that medical tourism is actually a very difficult term to even define from the beginning. It encompasses so many different types of care, so many different types of caregivers. So I'll turn to Dr. Vequist first. If you could give us, just paint a picture for us of the different types of medical tourism that's involved in this. It could be retirement care, it could be acute care, in-country, out-country, all the different kind of subsegments that encompass it.
Agreed. I think the definition of medical travel or medical tourism, which includes up to and including retirement tourism, is kind of like a continuum of health, wellness, medical surgical behaviors. So what you see is people traveling around the world seeking value when it comes to healthcare solutions for their life. What most people don't realize is that there is quite a lot of medical travel going on, and quite frankly, a lot of it is not very sexy. The largest percentage of procedures arguably traveled for worldwide is quite frankly dental, and that's because, like it or not, there's a perception in terms of the quality standards between, say, a dentist in Mexico and a dentist in the United States, that there's probably not that much difference. At least that's a perception by, for example, Americans. So therefore, that tends to be one of the highest forms of procedures performed. And then you have various different types of elective procedures up to and including cosmetic surgery. You have med-surg procedures. You have the spa travel, which is vibrant and actually growing. One of my board members, Susie Ellis with Spa Finder magazine, suggests that there's actually more spas in the United States now than there are McDonald's. And we've seen the growth of the med spa or medi-spa, which is the combination of both healthcare and wellness. So it's, again, the best way to think of it is a continuum. And then I'm glad you brought up retirement tourism. With the aging of the world, not just the United States and Germany and Japan, but with the aging of the world, you're going to see many more people that feel that they have to travel somewhere to basically retire in a comfortable manner. And so that will engage a lot of healthcare in that local vicinity as well. So it's a fun area to study, and it's definitely a changing area.
Great. Well, Dr. Badia, I'd be interested in your perspective, coming from the actual clinician standpoint. How has the field of medical tourism changed in Southern Florida over the last 10, 20 years when you've been in clinical practice, and how have you responded to that demand from patients, foreign and domestic?
Well, David mentioned the issue of value, but let's not forget quality. And I can tell you many times in the media when they're speaking about medical tourism or medical travel, it implies outbound. It implies people going to, say, I've been to Guatemala and visited an incredible dental center in Guatemala. But when it comes to certain sophisticated procedures, patients will often look for the best. And many times that's associated with big entities, the Mayo Clinics of the world or Cleveland Clinic. I actually wrote an article about 10 years ago, and I coined it reverse medical tourism, only because so much that I read in the media was the former, where patients going out. But the truth is that in Miami, that's been increasing exponentially for the past 10 years. So that is really an increasing force, because now patients through the internet get more and more educated and will, I'm an upper limb surgeon, so people come armed with all the options for a particular clinical problem.
Yeah. I think one of the more interesting things is not only are we seeing patients driving themselves to care providers, but also some of the more interesting models. So maybe Dr. Vequist, if you could talk about the model that I believe it's the Cleveland Clinic is set up with Home Depot. Is that the model?
That's correct.
And other types of large employers designating a center of excellence and driving all of their employees to those facilities.
Yeah, that's correct. It's a fascinating topic area, and we're expecting to see a lot more of that. In the United States, as many people are familiar, a large portion of the population obviously receives their health care from an employer or from a large entity. And one thing that the employers are doing is they're also seeking value. Again, value defined by Michael Porter in his Redefining Healthcare book in terms of looking, not necessarily focusing just on quality or just on price or just on perhaps the experience of the provider and the facility, but also looking for everything. They want it all. It's like when you go out and shop for a car, you're not just looking for something that is just the right price, you're looking for something that's just the right price that provides you the safety, the security, the comfort, the drive, the gas mileage, whatever it is you're looking for. So what large employers are doing, most large employers, if you're not familiar with it, what's called self-funded, meaning that they take all the risk and liability for their healthcare cost onto themselves without using a third-party insurer, for example. And so what they have the ability to do, the flexibility, arguably, to do, is to be able to go out and negotiate contracts with best-in-class providers. Now, we can have a long discussion about what best-in-class means and how it can be graded, but let's put it this way, it's like being famous. Pitbull is considered famous because we've heard of him and we see him and things of that nature. So that's what you would call a facility that is best-in-class, is something that a facility you've probably heard of or are familiar with. So what we've seen with, for example, Lowe's and the Cleveland Clinic is they have gone out and contracted with the Cleveland Clinic because they're considered arguably one of the best cardiac surgery locations in the world. And so what they do is they tell their employees, say somebody that's making minimum wage up front as a retail employee, checking out people as a cashier, and they tell them, hey, listen, if you or your family need a cardiac surgeon, we're going to send you to the best people on the planet. And by the way, if you go there, we're going to provide for not only all the health care, but there's no cost from you, no deductibles, no travel costs. We even send a loved one with you. We even put you up in a hotel and probably even give you a stipend. The reason they do that is because best-in-class or centers of excellence typically have lower cost. You can look at data from the Leapfrog group that talks about that in terms of waste, for example. They tend to have less waste, tend to do the procedures better, more efficient. They have economies of scale. For those of you from business, they're familiar with the economies of scale idea. And what they do is they basically deliver healthcare better, faster, cheaper. So by contracting with them and also giving them a large employee base to basically generate revenue from, they lower the margins or the profits on that particular contract. And so the employer gets lower cost and better outcomes, which leads to lower cost. And the Cleveland Clinic gets volumes. In one piece of data, which as I recall was from Mercer, it is suggested that in one employee situation, and it was an example situation, that, you ready for this? Lowe's could save around $60,000 by sending somebody to, again, the best center on the planet for cardiac surgery. And you have to remember that when we're talking scale, Lowe's has like 300,000 employees, not including family members. So the savings could be significant.
You know, we hear a lot about how healthcare providers are increasingly under pressure to be more transparent with their outcomes as well as their prices and their costs. I'd be interested from you, Dr. Badia, what has been your response to business models like what Dr. Vequist was talking about? I mean, are you seeing engagement between providers here in Southern Florida with large employers trying to position themselves as centers of excellence, or is it still going after individuals on a one-by-one basis?
Well, I think for cardiac surgery, that certainly makes sense because you're talking about something that's often a minimum 4 or 5 hospital day. I also applaud the Cleveland Clinic for developing the image that it's best on planet. I mean, being an old NYU cardiac surgery grunt,
yeah,
I can tell you, so there are a lot of great centers, but no question, Cleveland Clinic is tremendous. But is that cost effective for, say, the everyday things that, say, the Lowe's? I would argue what we're trying to do with the Ortho Now concept is actually ship out to different communities that you should have a walk-in orthopedic urgent care center where you'd be able to cut out the long ERs or the non-expert urgent care centers, which end up really driving up healthcare costs. So I would love to be able to go speak to Lowe's, and we're doing that with, say, FedEx. Actually, last night at the cocktail party, we talked about this, and saying to them, look, you're not going to fly in every worker throws out their back delivering packages. you're not going to fly them somewhere, right, to Cleveland or to Miami even. But if we could export this concept to different cities where the FedEx is everywhere, we'd be able to say there is a local ortho now. And that would really lower healthcare costs dramatically and increase quality. And that's really kind of what our mission is.
I mean, what you're saying really fits in well, because actually on the front of today's USA Today, there's an article about how the institution of the Affordable Care Act and Obamacare, with everybody signing up, the projections are utilization of healthcare is going to go through the roof. And so what's going to happen is our healthcare system is going to be looking for more efficient and more significant ways to expand access to care, to get people in, to get the care that they need and get them out. It's going to be a lot more important driving those kinds of volumes. And I know Dr. Vequist and I have been speaking about this. What's your perspective on where that's headed, and how is medical tourism, both domestic as well as international, going to support the changes in our healthcare system?
Yes, it's a fascinating issue, and again, we were just talking about it because my center did a report for the UN about 1.5 years, almost 2 years ago now, that looked at this very issue, and of course our predictions were what is being shown by the data that's being reported on the front page of the USA Today. Just real quickly on price transparency, also another interesting topic area. The front page of Becker's hospital report, actually, it's a well-known hospital industry trade journal. They actually feature Mount Sinai and the CEO here at a local Miami institution on trying to offer price transparency. Apparently he was on a local radio program and promised that Mount Sinai would try to be price transparent. Two issues came up after the ACA was signed into law that we think are going to be very impactful when it comes to healthcare, particularly here domestically, and is going to affect medical travel. And those two issues are, and somewhat controversial, so I'll admit this. The first issue is the utilization. Let's talk about that. It's very obvious that many of the things that were put in place by the ACA were an attempt to give more access to more people health care. And as part of that, there was an attempt to make sure that people didn't feel like they couldn't access health care whenever they needed to. So annual and lifetime maximums were taken out of insurance contracts. They were also made so that you couldn't have pre-existing conditions and other things. So we knew, and according to the data that we ran for the UN, and you can find the report out there by doing a search under my last name, that what's going to happen is we're going to see utilization rates that are more similar to what you would see in Great Britain, or more similar to what you're going to see in Canada, which have more of a socialized medicine feel, although there is private health care in both places. So what you're going to see is, with increased utilization and the expected rate of providers, particularly physicians, the mid-tier providers, as well as nurses and some of the basic services, those aren't keeping up. So we're going to have a system in the United States where it's going to be longer wait times, let's be honest. And that was pretty obvious. Now, for some reason, the academic community has not been covering this very well, hasn't been doing a lot of research in this. I think it's a pretty well-known fact, but unfortunately it hasn't been well spoken of, and it hasn't been brought up in the media. Quite frankly, I don't know if it's a conspiracy. I just think it's one of those controversial topics that people don't want to talk about. So that's one issue. Now, the other issue, and this is going to be interesting too, is the utilization, the increased utilization is going to be typically lower margin utilization to providers and to facilities, particularly domestically. So what we expect to see is, because of that and because of things like price transparency, as well as the availability of information about healthcare, we expect to see more medical travel. People are going to travel more domestically, first of all, and then ultimately they're going to potentially be traveling internationally. You're probably familiar that, for example, if a senator is shot by somebody in their home state, although they have a fantastic medical facility in their home state, that senator will then be flown to a specific facility, as happened just a couple years ago, for example, in Houston, Texas, even though the senator was from Arizona. So that domestic travel, which occurs primarily for VIPs and for people with money, for example, and this is an international examples, Peyton Manning, Kobe Bryant, A-Rod, formerly of the New York Yankees, probably not so much anymore, they have been traveling for healthcare, and they've traveled internationally. They traveled to Germany, in fact, all those cases. So what you're going to see is because of the wait times, because of some of the issues of higher utilization, you're going to see things that point to an emergence of a two-tiered system, and in that two-tiered system, you're going to have more patients seeking value, which includes traveling both domestically and internationally. Just real quickly, evidence of that, Gallup suggested a few years ago that within Asian countries, about 25% of the population of most of the Asian countries travel domestically for healthcare. So we'll look like that more quickly sooner than later here in the United States. And people are going to be experiencing six-week wait times for an MRI, for example. So some of the predictions.
Yeah, it's a daunting prospect. So Dr. Badia, if you could respond to that, I'd also like you to work into that discussions about how, as we have to take steps to improve access, we also have to take steps to improve education, clinician education as well. And I'd like you to address that and what you're doing on that side with your organization, with your center, and training those international clinicians.
I'd like to comment first that I was lecturing in Montreal about 3 months ago, and I can tell you that you're starting to see a reverse trend of what we're trying to go to. I had dinner with both another hand surgeon and a shoulder surgeon, which I do both, and they were telling me that they've gone completely private. They're actually the first private orthopedic subspecialist in the entire nation. It's because it's taken well over a year for a rotator cuff tear, elective surgery, which is not so elective when you can't sleep at night and you're in a lot of pain. And it's also making the process more difficult and expensive, because by the time you wait that long, then sometimes these are irreparable lesions. So, I'm hoping that our system doesn't move towards that, but certainly it will breed more of what you're talking about in Asia, where people will move around and the transparency of price. So in our center, for example, we give a global package, mostly to international patients, but we're starting to see it. I took care of a percussionist from Connecticut who plays for very well-known bands, Latin bands actually, and had surgery. So, but I adhere much to the rather than give someone a fish, but teach them how to fish, and that's what I think is important. Also, in medical tourism, is actually educating colleagues, and that has been a passion of mine. And in the end, the world is really flat, as Friedman said. So what happens is you end up consulting with your colleagues and maybe trained with you for some time, and then there's an ongoing exchange of ideas, which helps both medical systems. What we started in 2005 was something at that time called the Da Vinci Center. So this is a technology conference. Many of you know about the Da Vinci robot. Well, the Intuitive Surgical forced us to change our name, but we ended up rebranding ourselves as MARC, Miami Anatomical Research Center. So at any given time, probably right now, there may be a spine or a laparoscopy course going on, and 40% of our surgeon enrollees are international. I was actually faculty of a course, coincidentally, last week, and there were 30 Brazilian surgeons alone in that one course of only 80 people. So the medical education part is going to be huge. There's a young lady I met yesterday who's coming up with protocols. It's called MedEd Global, and protocols kind of like systems, operations research, where the person from the receptionist to the medical tech to the surgeon and to the rehab has almost a cookbook approach, so that we can standardize healthcare for developing countries as well.
All right, very good. So, we've talked about education, we've talked about access to care. Obviously, this is an innovation conference, and technology is a big part of it. And technology is playing an important role in actually facilitating and making medical tourism, medical travel a reality, both in terms of how patients find opportunities to get the care that they need, whether they're searching on the web or going to other different types of websites. The actual technology, the telehealth technology, the remote monitoring technology, electronic health records that facilitate that actual experience and that delivery of care, as well as on the back end when patients travel home, and how referring physicians or their primary care physicians are speaking with the specialists that they might have gotten care of. So could each of you speak to the role that technology plays and where the gaps might be in managing that continuum of care, Dr. Vequist?
Absolutely. The Medical tourism, and I'm glad you brought this up. Technology is such a fundamental piece of why medical tourism has been a growth area. And in our center, we typically show that it's basically caused by not only technology, but globalization. We have to remember, and I know this is not always a comfortable topic to address, that medical, healthcare, wellness is a business. And so when we talk about two-tiered systems where you have people that are wealthy, that are looking for perhaps procedures that are more technologically advanced or more clinically advanced, we have to remember that this is a business. And I know that makes some in the healthcare industry very uncomfortable. I suspect that my Kia that, for example, I might be driving at home is probably less advanced than the Lamborghini I saw on the street in South Beach yesterday night. And so I suspect that in healthcare, what you're going to see is this continuing technology gap in two-tiered systems, which means that you're going to see more private healthcare being more technologically advanced. Now, a couple things regarding technology and globalization. Again, technology driving globalization. Anybody know what the major thing that people do on the internet is? And try to keep your minds out of the gutter. So, number one, according to Pew Research, email. Number two, anybody? Social media. Almost 2 billion people on Facebook. Number three, it's the important one. It's not shopping. It's a great guess. It is, you ready for this? Searching for healthcare on the internet. So it's something that is ubiquitous to the human race, and so it is really driving that. But as Charlie mentioned, the Frost & Sullivan does a lot of great thought leadership on various technologies and in healthcare, and there's so much that is necessary in order to make medical tourism viable. Many Indian physicians, for example, use telecommunications tools, which most of us have access to, like Skype, to interact with patients all around the world, particularly in the United States. By the way, which is illegal, because if an Indian physician is basically acting like a doctor to a person in the United States and they're not licensed in that particular state as a physician, then they're engaging in illegal medicine. But I suspect that you're not going to see federal authorities flying to India and picking that person up and bringing him back to the U.S. to be tried here. The other thing is in terms of the continuum of care, which is a huge issue in medical tourism, because oftentimes if you travel, whether it's regionally across state boundaries or across international boundaries, the technologies that are necessary to keep up and promote good patient follow-up care are not often there. I actually spoke to an entrepreneur that's here that has a booth in the exhibition hall that is basically looking to do that for domestic patients. And so I mentioned to him, I said, wow, this is something for international patients that's a big issue. And also, don't forget the back-end technologies that are necessary, which is basically patient records. Think about patient records, keeping those secure and safe in the age of all the viruses. We have the Internet Explorer thing. So if you're out on Internet Explorer and you're entering in the specific sexual dysfunction that you have, then some hacker now knows about that because there was a flaw in Internet Explorer when you were sending that information through your email account to a physician, either domestically or internationally. So you can see how technology plays very nicely into medical travel, medical tourism, and choice of healthcare. So, Dr. Badia.
Well, the buzzword for what David's talking about is aftercare. So you can imagine for cardiac surgery, it's quite complex. But I mean, for what I do, if I do a shoulder replacement, and I do them outpatient, because it's very cost-effective, basically zero infection for prosthesis. But the challenge is that patient needs to have a good shoulder therapist. So what I enjoy doing is really interacting with my visiting fellows, and we even have therapists who visit the center, because in each of these countries, I can now have a first-name relationship with that therapist who's going to rehab my patient, because the success of that operation is only what the final outcome is. So if I don't have a good therapist following them in their country, then I'm not going to get those patients coming back. So that's a critical part. So we're hoping, and I'd like to give a plug, there's a company here called MedVision. So we're going to start working with them to be able to have this, so I can actually see the range of motion of that shoulder in something like Skype, but protected. Not that shoulder patients so concerned about is privacy, but certainly a lot of other medical problems are. But so this is HIPAA compliant, and but it will provide much more than simply an email from the therapist saying my patient's doing well and it's X range of motion. So we want to do the same thing in Ortho Now. In fact, we have a group that's probably going to put several in Lincoln, Nebraska, Omaha, maybe even St. Louis. But you think about Nebraska, huge state. So I don't know if it'd be considered medical tourism, but the Ortho Now in Lincoln can interact with the rancher 300 or 400 miles away to decide, should that ankle sprain come in, or can he just put on some leather chaps and elevate the leg and ice it? So these are clinical decisions that we can make remotely. And in fact, Putin just bought 20,000 of these medical kiosks that are going to be spread out along Siberia, because people just have no access to healthcare. So they'll be transmitting. The amazing thing is, I spoke to the CEO of this company, and they didn't even think of orthopedics, which is amazing. You'll go into this booth, get your blood pressure taken, maybe give you instructions how to draw blood, do all these things, and yet they hadn't done imaging. So we're proposing to them to do actual imaging, so that you stick your arm under that live fluoroscopy machine and then snap a picture and send that image to somebody, say in Moscow, who would say, you've got to come to the city and get a plate and screws put in. So that's a pretty exciting thing.
Yeah, we're already seeing, obviously, there are other companies that have developed a business model like Nighthawk, doing remote teleradiology services. So they based in Australia and doing radiology consults primarily for U.S. hospitals during the night, so that they'll put those digital images online and push them out to those radiologists who are in Australia. I think they're even certified down there to practice medicine, and then do the consults, and you get them back the next morning, so you address that backlog. We have a few minutes left to take any questions. Are there questions here from the audience? Yes, sir.
Just curious about the consults. I'm curious, how is that different? One doctor consulting with another one who's offshore, and a patient consulting with a physician who's offshore. How is that? Oh, sorry. I was just curious, this term of consults, I'm just curious, how is that any different? A physician consulting about a U.S. patient with an offshore person versus the patient consulting with an offshore physician. Is there some loophole in the laws that allows a physician to do that?
No, there isn't. There was actually a couple interesting cases out there, but I can speak to one specifically. A group of California physicians decided that they want to go into rural Nevada and be able to open up a clinic there, which they were going to service through telemedicine and be able to have a mid-tier provider, say a physician assistant or an advanced practice nurse, something of that nature that was there. They happened to be licensed in the state of Nevada, but the Nevada physicians didn't like that. So they got together, and as I recall, the case went all the way up to the Nevada Supreme Court. Nevada Supreme Court sided on the side of the California physicians, saying, hey, listen, they're licensed in the state, so they can practice in the state, they can practice telemedicine. But the point is you have to be licensed. And each state obviously has specific requirements about that. Many states do not have a residency requirement, so therefore you can do things like teleradiology, which has been around for a few years, where people do that, particularly in the night shifts. But it would be like, take this for example. So let's say for whatever reason I had a fun time messing with people, and so I went out to a costume store and got a police officer's outfit and went out there and started pulling people over and doing pulling people over, making them empty their pockets, body cavity searches, whatever I get my jollies doing. Do you think that's legal? Yeah, it's not. So obviously you can't dress up like a police officer and pretend you're a police officer. Well, you also can't pretend you're a doctor in most states. You actually have to be licensed and certified. So if a physician internationally acts like a doctor within a state, then obviously it's going to be illegal. The problem is, how do you sue them? How do you get after them? How do you criminally charge them?
Although physician interactions, which are critical, because that, particularly when you're coming from different levels of medical excellence, is not a problem. But yet, when patients will often write me through the internet from abroad, I'm very careful about providing very strict recommendations. It's all very cursory. Whereas with another physician, it's not a problem. So. These things are much more regulated when it comes to the patient level.
Great. Well, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, I was just wondering, you just said about someone Skyping from India and a doctor, consulting with a patient over here.
Yeah, correct.
I'm a little confused about those things too, because I'm trying to get into that field. And what happens, like, when, say, a patient comes from India and has a cardiac thing done NYU and goes back. So when when the patient is in India, should he consult the Indian doctors there, or should he be Skyping with the American doctor in NYU? And then what happens to the law of the same thing? Or say someone from here goes to India, and I know a person who got a mastectomy done right now there and is coming back here, and for medicines and for other things, would she go here to a doctor, or would it be illegal for her to consult her doctor in India, although she is an American citizen? I'm a little confused about that.
Yeah.
Just get a quick response.
Very quick. Yeah, very quickly. I can tell you what the word from there's not a lot of case law, so I can't tell you exactly what is going to happen when it gets into the court systems. But one of my colleagues is a law professor from Harvard Law School, Glenn Cohen, and he suggests that basically that this is a very interesting field where we don't necessarily know, but yes, it is illegal for somebody to be a physician in the United States, even if they're doing it over Skype. So it truly is an illegal activity, but other than the NSA, very few people know who exactly is Skyping in and talking to Americans and telling them that they're a physician from India. So the best thing is, as we mentioned before, the idea of a continuum of care. Dr. Badia and I both kind of addressed that. There should be a continuum. There should be handoffs, and those handoffs should be intelligent and well thought out, and it should make sense. What's going to be interesting, very quickly, is that physicians in the United States, such as Dr. Badia, if he happens to see a patient that went internationally and received care, according to Professor Cohen, what will be more likely to happen is, since that person is unable to sue an Indian physician or the Indian hospital unless they have assets that are easily tapped in the United States, they'll be more likely to sue the U.S. physician who they see after they come back into country and if they consult with them. So we have seen a trend of American physicians perhaps being somewhat reluctant to deal with patients coming back into the country. That doesn't mean the American physician is likely to lose the lawsuit. It means that they are likely to get sued more. And so this is from a Harvard law professor, and I accept it. So.
Well, the short answer is a physician. And we touched on that. You have to have a relationship with the local medical community, and it should be in a non-threatening manner. So many times the questions that come later come physician to physician, so I'm really not practicing medicine abroad. I did something that is a procedure. That's why really primary care doesn't lend itself, because you're not going to follow somebody's hypertension ongoing. But if I do that shoulder replacement, it's a very technical thing. The person came because certain expertise, and it's going to be followed by physicians abroad.
Great.
Charlie, we have to
Thank
wrap
you.
up right now, so.
Let's give a hand to our panelists.